Hello chess friends and welcome to your side of chess channel and welcome back to our Catalan opening studies. So in this studies we have seen this beautiful opening analyzed for both sides. So we have seen the most important strategic concepts, ideas, plans, middle game strategies. We have seen also the common tactics that are possible in the early stage of the game of this beautiful and amazing chess opening. And today we're continuing with our Catalan opening studies and the so-called open defense. We have analyzed now recently the open defense with different ideas, with different approaches. And if you're interested more into the Catalan opening, if you're interested also in the closed setups and also some other opportunities for both sides, please check out our playlist. Here's the link. You can have, I think, a great preparation in this really double-edged opening. So today we're continuing again with the open defense in the so-called classical line with an amazing gameplay by two world champions. We have here really the clash of the titans. We have here an amazing gameplay by Dingleren and Magnus Carlsen. So the game was played in 2019 in Croatia, in Zagreb. I live here in Croatia. I followed also one amazing game live. I was there when Fabiano Caruana and Magnus Carlsen played really an epic game. The game ended with a draw, but really with cool endgame tactics. So in my opinion, it was an amazing tournament and Magnus Carlsen won the super event with a great performance. So let's see now this tactical battle. Dingleren with the white pieces opened with the move d4. Magnus Carlsen's response was knight to f6 and after move c4 e6, knight to f3, the counter Nimzo or anti-Nimzo Indian approach. Of course, if you play knight to c3, then you probably get pinned with the move bishop to b4. So Magnus transposes into structures of the Queen's Gambit declined, and now we have the amazing Catalan opening move with the move g3, bishop to e7, bishop to g2, castling, and now comes the open defense move d takes c4, immediately letting the position explode in the center of the board, and of course the game becomes now really spectacular in the center of the board. So now queen to c2 played by Dingleren, which is of course an idea to get the pawn back, but the downside for white, even if you recapture the pawn, is that you have lost time to do so. You see, you have to play one tempo, then in the optimal case you play another tempo to recapture one pawn. Meanwhile black is doing something, meanwhile black is developing the piece, and meanwhile black is activating the pieces for sure. So now Magnus even plays the wild line with the move b5, supporting simply the pawn on c4. If black, if white doesn't play the game correctly, if black manages maybe to fix the structure with c6, a6, knight from b to d7, knight to d5, bishop to b7, this could be a solid approach. So that's why white has to be now aggressive in order to get the pawn back. So here Ding immediately challenges now this small pawn chain. Of course, is trying to deflect the pawn from the defense of the pawn on c4. Magnus advances now the pawn, and now there are many things that you can do. Knight to e5 and queen to c4 are not really the best moves here for white. For instance, if you play queen to c4 immediately, then you get this one, bishop to a6. The problem is now you have to step back, and now after knight from b to d7, you could maybe challenge here white's rook by liberating the diagonal, but actually black doesn't have to be scared here. Black can even go into a wild line. This wasn't played in the game, but of course we're studying theory here. We want to know what's going on the board. After move knight to e5, actually black can play aggressively with the move knight to e5, and after something like d takes e5, of course we can of course lock the diagonal by playing the move knight to d5. And I think here black is already better. We'll simply push the pawn on c5, c4, and notice that black is here a 3 versus 2 pawn majority on the queen side. On the other hand, white has this double pawn structure on the e file, so it's much harder for white to make progress than it is for black. Of course, black will have, I think, here fun really on the queen side. Of course, you can also after move knight to e5, you can also play the move bishop to a8, but now we simply pick up the centralized pawn on d4, and I think after bishop to g2, black is also solid here. For instance, the engine gives here slightly edge in black's favor. Will eventually push the pawn on c5, c4, connect everything, get the bishop into the game. This pawn is weak, the pieces are centralized, this bishop is good. So in my opinion, really a nice game for black, although down the exchange. Notice this, memorize this line, because it could happen to you. Maybe you get challenged in this way, so I think it's a line worth to know. So let's go back. Instead of this move queen to c4, you don't have to, of course, play like the game like this. You can, of course, play immediately the move knight to e5, but then again the game becomes quite spectacular after this line, queen to d4, and this line will analyze also in a beautiful game played by here. I found an amazing game, Shabalov, with the black pieces against Samuel Shackland, in which Shabalov allowed this kind of an idea, but again took now the knight on e5 and had now even a 4 versus 2 pawn majority all down the exchange. But as I said, we'll come to the part later in our analysis. This will be a separate video. This was an amazing gameplay by Shabalov here with the black pieces. So let's go back. So that's why here many choices you have. Queen to c4, as we said, knight to e5, not so good. So that's why the main line is here, knight from f to d2, now liberating the long diagonal. Now the knight is not loose when we play the move knight to e5 after queen to d4. Notice the knight was always endangered here on e5. Now with this motif, Dingler gets out of the attack, potential attack, but liberates now the long diagonal for the light square bishop. So that's why Magnus has to lock now the long diagonal. We have now knight to c4, and as I said in the beginning of the video, although white grabs a pawn but lost many tempi, you see, played once with the queen, plays then with the knight, then with the knight. So 3-4 tempi he needed just in order to get the pawn back. Meanwhile, black has now cemented the position on the light squares, has locked now the diagonal, and can play now, of course, a breakthrough motif with the move c5. And this is the way they go. You have to play the game like this. If you don't play aggressively here with the black pieces, you could be left with a backward pawn on c7 here. When maybe you get blocked out, there could be huge pressure maybe around the square c7. So that's why Magnus played really aggressively here. c5, we have d takes c5, Magnus attacks now the knight, and now after move knight to e3, you cannot play now bishop to b7. This wouldn't be good. You cannot retreat here. You cannot protect everything around the square d5, because you get simply knight to d5. After bishop to d5, rook to d1, you get pinned here. Look at this, e4 is going to happen. You play bishop to c6, but now bishop to e3, and suddenly black is having huge problems here. White is continuing the game with an extra pawn here on the queen side. Actually, with this supported pass pawn, black could have now huge problems. So that's why after move knight to e3, you cannot step back. You have to play now again aggressively. So that's why Magnus played first knight from b to d7. We have here knight takes d5, e takes d5 here by Magnus, and now actually bishop to d5 wouldn't be so good for Dingler. Here Magnus set up sort of a positional threat, because after rook to c8 you could maybe push the pawn further, but now after move knight to e5, rook to d1 will simply take it out. Bishop knight to c6, and look at this. Now you could maybe try this tactic. There is also one game in the database, but actually after rook to f7, rook takes d8, and the knight bishop to d8 here, black should be pretty solid, I think. Although we have lost the queen, but we have gained a rook and a minor piece, especially I think on light squares. White could have now huge problems. There is also, of course, some discoveries. The bishop on c1 is a little bit endangered, it's a little bit loose. White has now a lack of development, so I would not really love to play anymore this game from White's perspective. But pay good attention, that was all possible after move e takes d5. So Ding, of course, a great theoretician, a great tactician, a great player, of course, didn't fall for this. He played simply c6. Now Magnus goes with rook to c8. Look how dynamic really this position. It's really an open battle all over the board. But now bishop to f4, of course, by Dingler, and he simply activates the piece and hopes, of course, to get the pawn through here on the queen side. So we have now knight to c5. Magnus is disconnecting now the queen from the defense of the pawn, and now Ding makes maybe a slightly inaccurate move. He plays now the move c7. It's tempting, but actually a more aggressive approach to the game is rook to d1, immediately pushing here the position to the limits, maybe also attacking now the pawn on d5. We will also analyze here an amazing gameplay by Alireza Firuza against Nihal Sarin, in which Alireza played this line, so they reached the same position, but he played a rook to d1, a more aggressive approach. But in this game, Ding played the tempting c7, allowed here Magnus to regroup, queen to d7. Now if you play rook to c1, we'll simply push the pawn further on d4, and now there is now even the threat of d3, so it's now also a tricky game here for black. So that's why here after move queen to d7, Ding Liren continued with knight to d2, and now an amazing move here by Magnus Carlsen, g5. G5 was, I think, a certain turning point of the game. The engine is here giving equal chances for both sides. Nothing wrong, I think, in a real sense here for white, but I think in this moment Magnus is taking over, felt a little bit more comfortable in position, because here after bishop to e5, f6, the bishop retreats, and now Magnus gets the pawn back, has now opportunities to activate the pieces. The knight is very good here in the center of the board, has of course a great control of many squares. This bishop very active, you know, at least okay, this bishop is supporting the knight on c5, but I think so far really solid play by Magnus. And okay, there are some downsides about this position. The pawn on d5 is weak. We have weakened also a little bit the light squares in front of the king, but this had to be played. Magnus had now a great activity. So in the game, queen to d1, we have knight to e3, attacking the bishop. We have knight to b3. And pardon me, knight to e6, knight to b3. We have bishop to c4, attacking now the knight. Knight to a5 here by Ding Liren, attacking now the bishop. And now knight takes d4. We have queen takes d4. And now here a very important move by Magnus, king to g7, connecting now also the king to the pawns. Now Magnus has a great grip on dark squares. And of course you don't want to play here knight takes c4. If that happens, then look at this, d takes c4. Maybe you trade off the queens, but now this 2 versus 1 situation could bother white in the continuation of the game. If black pushes the pawns through, supported maybe with the bishop, supported with the rooks, there could be huge problems, of course, in white's position. So that's why after move king to g7, here Ding activated the rook on c1. We have bishop takes e2, but this was an attempt by Ding Liren to simplify the game. Good choice, I think, because after bishop to e2, now we have this one, rook to c7, queen to c7. He attacks now, simply here both of these bishops lined up on the e file. We have bishop to c5, attacking the queen, and now Ding Liren has also the pawn back, and Magnus has now opportunities, of course, to retreat with the bishop. So now rook to e8, played by Magnus, protecting the bishop on e2. We have now queen to b7. We have queen takes b7, knight takes b7, and now bishop on f8. And okay, we have reached now the fully endgame stage, in which we have to say black is slightly better here because of pawns on both sides, but the issue here is that the pawn structure is symmetrical. It's very hard to create a passer. So what Magnus would love to get here is a position maybe without the rooks on the board, but maybe with a position in which, maybe just imagine, maybe we don't have the a pawn, but black doesn't, white doesn't have the b pawn. So maybe black has a passer on the b file, or maybe white has a passer on the a file. But what you have to do with the bishop pair in this types of position is somehow just somewhere to create a passer. And remember this when we come to the later stage of the game, because this kind of a thing will happen, but it will come in really beautiful and epic way how Magnus produced this idea in the later stage of the game. So here, bishop to c6, attacking the rook, rook to e7, f3, Magnus retreats. Mission accomplished. The first task is over here. The rooks are off the board. So bishop to e7. Now we have a fully endgame, 2 bishops versus a bishop and knight. But so far, it's still about equal, but we have to create now our passer. So of course, let's see now what happens. So king to f2, we have f5, we have king to e3, bishop to g8, we have king to d3, and now an amazing move by Magnus, g4. This move is paralyzing, notice, the pawn on the h file. So the pawn on the h file cannot move, and what Magnus would love to do now is somehow to reroute the bishop here on c5, then to get it on g1, and then attack the bishop, attack the pawn on h2, because the pawn on h2 is paralyzed by the spaces that black created now here on the king side. So really nice here move by Magnus Carlsen. And what here Ding Liren should have probably done is also to do the same, paralyzing now the pawn on a7, doing also a similar idea, locking now the pawn and somehow trying to attack it, and basically forcing also black here to go a little bit and be defensive, trying somehow to defend the pawn. But what Ding did immediately, he played now his first mistake in the game. He plays now the move knight to a5 and allowed here Magnus Carlsen to get the bishop into the game. And Magnus uses this moment immediately. He locked now the pawn on h2, as we said, and now he wants to simply attack it. So mission accomplished. He traded off the rooks, will eventually create a pass pawn. So from this point on, I think the game becomes a one-way ticket in black's favor. So knight to c4, Magnus attacks the pawn, knight to e3, bishop to e6. Magnus is protecting now the pawn on g4. We have f takes g, king to e2, and now h5. We have bishop to d5, bishop to d7. No trades of bishops. When you are having, of course, the bishop pair against the bishop and the knight, you should not trade any pieces. The bishop pair gives you main strength, so that's why good choice here by Magnus to keep the pieces on the board. So bishop to b3, maybe again here b3, trying to keep everything compact on the queen side, but from bishop to b3, Magnus takes over here and simply plays now the risky move king to bishop to h2, because he allowed now here Ding Liren to actually trap the bishop, but it doesn't matter. We have now the move h4 after g takes h4, bishop to e5, and that's the position, as I said, that we wanted to get. The pawn structure is not symmetrical anymore. We have here a perfect symmetry through 2 versus 2, but that's the position that we wanted to get. We wanted to create a passer. Okay, white is also a passer, but this passer supported by both of these bishops is unstoppable. So in my opinion, this should be now completely winning endgame here for black. So memorize this when you play endgames, that you have to create a passer that will be then supported by the beautiful bishop here. So now knight to c4, it doesn't matter, g3, first the check, king steps back, bishop to f4, which is of course controlling the knight. The knight cannot be maneuvered anymore towards the center of the board. The knight is a little bit paralyzed, is a little bit out of game. Here the bishop is controlling this knight in a good way. We have bishop to d1, bishop to c6, b3, fixing everything. Now Magnus gets closer, and now bishop to e4, keeping the bishops in the center of the board where they're controlling most of the squares. And as I said, the knight is simply out of game because of the restriction of the dark square bishop. King to f1, we have king to g7, king to g1, king to f6. Magnus gets the king closer. Here you see Ding Liren is also trying to push the pawn, but that's the issue when you play on both sides. The bishop is a long-range piece. The bishop can also attack, but also defend the potential promotion. So, for instance, this bishop is waiting, just waiting, and nothing can happen with this passer on the h file. So, not even a threat here by Ding Liren. So, Magnus goes with king to d5. We have a6, king to d4, getting the king closer. We have king to c3, attacking this this weak pawn. We have bishop to e6, bishop to c2, attacking now, knight to a5, bishop to c7, attacking the knight. We have knight to b7, and now after bishop to d3, this pawn is really weak. From this point on, it's really messed up game. So king to g1, even if you play something like king to g2, first you get a check, then we can play this one. We simply push the pawn further, and with the support of the bishop, as we said, we have a potential promotion. So after bishop to d3, king to g1, and bishop to a6, in this position, actually, Ding Liren even resigns. So as we said, there is this threat of a check, and then we deliver another check. We just push the pawn further. So messed up game here for the Chinese grandmaster. So really spectacular game, I think. In the beginning, Magnus played really this open defense, great tactics in the beginning, played then solid defense in the middle game stage, activated the bishop pair, created a pass pawn. Of course, Ding played a couple of inaccuracies, but Magnus played almost a perfect game. Incredible performance by the former world champion. So, okay, I hope that you enjoyed this game. Interesting ideas of the Catalan openings for sure. If you want to see more about this opening, so as I said, we have analyzed also the closed defense of the Catalan opening. Now we have started the open defense. So here's the link of our playlist. And if you like this content, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. See you soon with some more videos, and what to say, chess is the best, of course.